So the Mishnah is on Daf Mem Hey. Hanochrim ha'ovdim es heharim v'agvos. So the Torah says that we have to destroy the places where there are idols when we get into Eretz Yisrael. We'll see exactly at what point. But the pasuk says al heharim. That's what has to be destroyed. And therefore the har itself that was worshipped by a guy, by an idolater, is not usur. Again, the person who worshipped the mountain is chayiv misa. Goy is chayiv sayif. But as far as the mountain itself, we're allowed to benefit from the mountain. But what the Torah means when it says al heharim v'alakvos means mashalem asurim. What they used to do is they used to beautify the mountain with silver and gold, and that silver and gold is prohibited. Shenemar lo sachmod kesef v'zav alehem. Now, the Mishnah quotes an extra ribui to teach us that the silver and gold that's upon the mountains is prohibited. And this is going to remind us of a sugya later on in Masechta Avoda Zara about a Jew who gets a hold of something that belongs to a guy and he adorns it. And the Mishnah later is going to talk about whether or not this generates an Isra Avodah Zarah, and the Gemara is going to determine that if he takes away the ornaments or the adornments, the silver and gold, then the object itself is mutter. In any event, now the Mishnah goes on to record two statements that seem almost identical. One is Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, and the other is Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yossi HaGlili Omer Elohehem al heharim, below heharim Elohehem. The Torah requires us to destroy not the mountains, but that which is attached to the mountains, on the mountains. Eloheim ala gvos, and the same thing with regard to gvos are smaller mountains. Velo hagvos Eloheim, the mountain itself, or the hill itself, is not prohibited. But now Rabbi Yossi HaGlili has to ask himself a question. It would seem that the reason why mountains and hills are excluded from the Isra Avodah Zarah, the Cherem, is probably because they're attached to the Karka. So therefore the question arises, Ma'ashera Asura. We'll see later on that the Pasuk explicitly says that we have to destroy their Asherah. And presumably the Asherah, which the Pasuk says Ashereim, Tegadeun, means that even though it's still attached to the ground, the tree itself is prohibited. So Rabbi Yossi HaGlili says, in other words, something which exists in nature, like a mountain, cannot become prohibited by an Oved Kocham's Avoda. But in the case of something that was created by man, for example, man planted a seed, and from that seed a tree grew. The tree is not totally in nature. It's not absolutely natural in the sense that it took man's intervention, his yad, in order to create the tree. And therefore, Rabbi Yossi HaGlili formulates the principle that kol sheyesh bo tfisas yad adam asa. Anything that requires human intervention to create it is prohibited. And that comes under the law of Asherah. Omer Rabbi Akiva, ani ovin va'odin lefanov. Like I'm going to try to present a theory and deliberate it in the presence of Rabbi Yossi HaGlili. And I'm going to say that kol mokum shata motze har gavoa begiva nisa v'etz ranon da sheyesham avodas kochavim. That when the Torah speaks about mountains and hills, it's not telling you that the mountain and the hill, if it was worshipped, itself becomes Avodah Zarah, but rather it's telling you, I would call it almost an Eitzah Tova Kamashmalon, that since when you enter into the land of Israel, the Torah requires that you destroy and uproot all idolatry, the Torah wants to tell you where to look, where to search for idolatry. On the tops of the mountains and the hills, you'll find these adornments of gold and silver, which are meant for idolatrous purposes. Rabbi Yossi Aglili asks the Gemara, Hainu Tanakama, what is the Rabbi Yossi Aglili adding to the Tanakama? It seems from the presentation of the Mishnah, there's some sort of controversy between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yossi Aglili. What are they arguing about? And the question now is going to arise that these adornments that are added to the mountains, at some point or other, they become batel to the mountains. They are like dug into the mountains in order to be attached to the mountains. And therefore, since the mountain itself doesn't have the status of Avoda Zara, and it's not also, because it says Al HaHorim, so too, one could argue that the adornments themselves become prohibited, are not prohibited because they are part of the mountains. So Omar Rami Bar Chom Reish Lakish, the Machlokas Shin Tanakama and Rabbi Yossi revolves around Sipui Har Kehar. What is the status of the covering over the mountain? And here we're talking about all those adornments that they attach to the mountains. Tanakama Salvar, the Tanakama says, well, these adornments are not batel to the har. They stand on their own as a separate entity. And that's called tzipui har eno kehar. So if the Torah says that the har itself is not prohibited, it doesn't say a word about the adornments that are attached to the har. In other words, again, the Chachamim at this point in the Gemara see the adornments as a separate entity. And therefore, umitzar, the hafkah, the removal of the status of Avodah Zarah to the mountains does not apply to the adornments. For Rabbi Yosef Glili Savar, Sipui Har Hareu Kehar. In other words, according to Rabbi Yosef Glili, the adornments that cover the mountains for the purpose of Avodah Zarah are batel and are sort of swallowed up by the mountains themselves, and therefore Rabbi Yosef Glili is matir. So let's just make a note of this, that according to this presentation, before we see Rav Sheshes, Rabbi Yossi is the Mekil and Rabbanan are the Machmirin. And that's going to be turned upside down by Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes Omar, no. Kuli Alma, Sipui Har, Enokek Har. Everybody is going to prohibit, even Rabbi Yossi, the adornments on the har as a separate entity, and they're not batel, they're not, as we said, subservient or attached as auxiliary to the mountain, and therefore the ptur of har does not apply to tzipur, and therefore even Rabbi Yossi Aglili, according to Rav Sheshes, would concede to the Chachamim that the tzipur of the har is definitely asur. It's not batel to the har, it's a separate entity. And here we begin Memhei Amud Beis.